did in 2007 and the second study we did in 2011. And we were able to sort of draw some very interesting conclusions about who tends to commit fraud, what types of frauds tend to be committed in what types of countries, what the average dollar value of those frauds is. And I thought I would share that with you today as sort of a backdrop for how we investigate fraud. And I think one of the most interesting things in our findings were that this type of fraud financial fraud in particular, is on a dramatic upswing, and we anticipate that trend to continue. So, as I said, the first thing that KPMG did was International did a study in 2011 to follow our analysis from 2007 of fraudulent behaviors in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And this research was based on 348 actual fraud investigations conducted by KPMG in 69 countries. So this would have been the 2011 data. The 2007 data is a similar batch of approximately 400 cases. And we found some general trends. The fraudsters tended to be male, they tended to be middle-aged, they committed fraud against their employer, they held a management function, and they often worked in collusion with other perpetrators. But I think what's particularly interesting is how these numbers break out, and you can see what the trends are over time. The first thing that I wanted to touch on was just the methodology that we used. From the thousands of fraud investigations conducted by KPMG Forensic, the data has been collated relating to the sample comprising white-collar crimes with a clear perpetrator. The frauds included in this analysis comprised material misstatements of financial results, theft of cash and or other assets, abuse of expenses, and a range of other fraudulent acts. Excluded from the sample frauds are frauds considered to be of no material value, acts of misconduct, or those where the fraud could not be substantiated during the investigation, as well as cases lacking sufficient detail. The analysis identifies the fraudster profiles and details more common to the types of fraud that they committed. Conditions that tend to enable fraud, typical follow-up actions by organizations impacted by fraud, and also what the trends are over time. We don't reveal the individual names of the parties involved, but we do, all of this tracks back to individual case experience in interviews. So, not surprisingly, typically most fraudsters are motivated by some sort of financial greed. What's interesting, though, is when you start breaking it down, that's not a surprise to anyone, but if you start looking at age, the first thing that our survey found was that the typical age for a fraudster was between 36 and 45. And this group rose from 39% of cases in 2007 to 41% in 2011. This is closely followed by a group accounting for 35% of fraudsters who were between 46 and 55 years old. Additionally, if you apply gender to this graph, what you'll find is that while men were found to be more likely perpetrators of detective fraud, 85% in 2007 and 87% in 2011, women in the Americas, 22%, and Asia Pacific, 23%, are almost three times more likely to be involved in a fraud than in Europe, the Middle East, or Africa. This might be due perhaps to fewer women in senior positions in old Europe and Africa compared with other regions of the world. The survey also finds that men commit more fraud than women, which seems to be a reflection on the gender makeup of companies generally. The gender gap in fraud penetration may reflect women's underrepresentation in senior management position, and as a consequence, fewer opportunities to commit fraud. Next, we looked at the rank of the person committing fraud within an organization. And you'll see that this skews overwhelmingly to senior management level folks. So already we're looking for someone who's probably middle-aged, probably a senior manager. And within the fraud, We found people most often entrusted with the company's sensitive information and able to override controls are statistically more likely to become perpetrators. This is borne out of survey evidence that senior management is more frequently implicated in fraud than junior staff. In 2007, our survey found that 60% of fraudsters held senior-level supervisory and management positions, while this group remains the most likely fraudsters. According to the 2011 analysis, the overall percentage fell to 53%. So what we're seeing is a rise in fraud in middle management and somewhat of a decrease in senior management, although senior management is in fact still the leader. Where do they work? And this I particularly enjoyed. We found that most people who commit fraud are employed either in operations and sales or in finance. And that accounts for almost 70% of frauds. Additionally, the other departments where they're likely to work are in procurement or in the CEO's office, where we've had incidences of, it's a form of identity theft, but it's where someone who may not be the CEO themselves, but someone who works in their office, assumes their identity and begins doing transactions or trades for their own financial gain. Legal function folks, as you might imagine, have the lowest incidence. And in fact, that declined in analysis. Also, when you look at the amount of time that someone has spent in an organization, in 2007, 36% of fraudsters were likely to have worked at a company for between 3 and 5 years before detection of the fraud. In 51% of cases, they worked at the company for more than 5 years, and in 22% of cases for more than 10 years. In 2011, the analysis shows an increase in the detection of fraud among longer-term employees. It reveals that 60% of fraudsters worked at the company for more than 5 years before the fraud was detected, while 33% of fraudsters worked there for more than 10 years. Given that fraudsters usually work for their employer for over 5 years before discovery, whereas the average fraud has occurred for just over 3 years by the time of its discovery, it is plausible that those who commit fraud often do not join organizations with the intent to commit fraud. However, changes in personal circumstances or pressures to meet aggressive work targets may influence the onset of fraudulent activity. They then may commit fraud once they have their feet comfortably under the table and, having gained the trust of their colleagues, have identified weak controls and opportunities to exploit the business. And I think with the increased competitiveness of the business climate, this is a real trend that we're seeing in the types of frauds. The reason why people commit fraud isn't necessarily initially for financial gain. It may be because the company is underperforming and someone wants to cover a short-term loss, which then becomes a long-term loss. So then they wind up in a pattern of covering up and covering up and covering up. That seems to be a trend that's accelerated. Also, just to compare this information with the earlier data, what we're seeing is that it looks, if you look at senior managers, you have a senior manager who's highly likely to be committing fraud. Also, they tend to be people who have been with the firm for over 10 years. So it's very senior people is where this fraud is being pushed. So not surprisingly, the desire for financial gain is the biggest driver of fraud. Attempts are to conceal losses or poor performance, possibly due to pressures to meet budgets and targets, to enhance bonuses, or to safeguard against loss of employment, provide the motivation. Misappropriation of assets, notably due to embezzlement and procurement fraud, accounted for 43% of the fraud surveyed in 2011. This echoes the findings in 2007. In second place is fraudulent financial reporting, which raises concerns about the pressures placed on management to achieve targets. Companies that fall victim to misreporting and other types of fraud should consider whether they set onerous targets and exert excessive pressures on employees to achieve them. Faced with the criticism about underperformance or concerned by the threat of reduced bonus or loss of employment, the staff might be tempted to hype up their performance by misstating results or guard against potential financial hardship by defrauding the business. There tends to be less fraud in companies that make intolerance of fraud part of the corporate culture, and which set realistic and achievable targets for employees. It's important, however, that the corporate culture is cascaded across the organization by management who act at all times in accordance with the corporate values. Entities, though they can control their own cultures, are subject to outside influences on employees. In particular, organizations need to be mindful of the impact of mounting personal financial pressures on employees due to the global economic crisis. In more austere times, formerly trustworthy employees affected by adverse changes in their personal circumstances might be more tempted to commit fraud when they spot an opportunity. Given that the frauds we analyzed, that it took on average nearly 3.5 years between fraud and such a detection, it seems that there may be a significant increase in newly detected cases over the next few years due to current and recent increased financial hardship. So we saw a corollary there. And I think one of the most interesting parts of this analysis were that fraud as a result of weak internal controls was up to 74% in 2011. The difficult economic climate may be partly to blame for this, and tighter budgets are forcing some companies to cut costs in their control environments. Less robust controls and fewer resources to monitor controls allow for greater exploitation by fraudsters. Although necessary to preserve profits, such cost cutting should be balanced with effective risk management. Many frauds continue to be exposed by formal or informal whistleblowing mechanisms. In 2007, companies were alerted to fraud by whistleblowers in 1/4 of cases, with complaints from customers or suppliers accounting for a further 13%. In 2011, formal internal whistleblower reports accounted for 10% of detections, while anonymous tip-offs were responsible for uncovering 14% of frauds. A further 8% of frauds were identified due to consumer or supplier complaints, while 6% came in response to issues raised by third parties, including banks, tax authorities, regulators, competitors, or investors. And this graph actually shows how the strategies used by those committing fraud has changed with regard to controls. That 1 in 7 frauds is now discovered by chance puts question marks over the effectiveness of controls and management review at detecting and preventing fraud. In 2007, 8% of frauds were discovered by accident, rising to 13% in 2011. The upshot is that companies seem to depend increasingly on the good consciences of staff or third parties, on accidental discovery, or in a few cases, on confessions to identify potential fraud. In aggregate, these methods account for detection just over half of the frauds in the 2011 survey.
Problem. There's a tendency to categorize things discovered by third parties as having been discovered by accident, when in fact the discovery by third parties is a legitimate control. So if my customer finds out that my managers are defrauding me, that's legitimate control. That's not discovered by accident.
That was actually, I think that distinction was made within the interview process that we engaged in. We might want to discuss it after the presentation.
The numbers sound really high then.
Well, to follow on that point, it's highly likely that many known instances of fraud go unreported. This may be due to a staff's unwillingness to report colleagues to third parties, reluctance to make a complaint, or because individuals conclude it is unnecessary to raise a particular issue. Individuals often argue it is not their place to provide tip-offs. Others fear repercussions, such as the loss of their job, especially where the fraud involves line or senior managers or board members. Globally, there are moves to create more formal frameworks to promote whistleblowing, such as initiatives intended to create more secure environments in which to tip off. In the United States, for example, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 intends to award whistleblowers a bounty worth 10% and 20% of fines levied for financial misconduct. In some parts of the world, there are long-standing protections for whistleblowers in the In the United Kingdom, for example, the Public Interest Discourse Act of 1998 protects workers who blow the whistle where there is a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed. Such incentives and protections can be helpful, but the fact remains that informal or formal whistleblowing should not be relied on as a principal detection tool.
Question?
Yeah.
What's an estimate of the undetected frauds?
I actually have that as one of my next slides. I have it broken down geographically by average fraud. So,
I'll wait.
okay. So, based on this set of frauds that we analyzed, we then looked at a set of warning signs, or red flags that we thought indicated that fraud was likely. And this model actually shows two graphs about red flags and the resulting actions both in 2011 and 2007. And what we found was that the number of fraud cases preceded by a red flag rose to 56% of cases in 2011 from 45% in 2007. However, instances where an action was taken following the initial red flag fell massively. Just 6% of initial red flags were acted upon in the 2011 analysis, compared with almost 1/4, 24%, in 2007. Companies are failing to read and act quickly on the warning signs. Ignored red flags are a license for perpetrators to carry on operating, and a missed opportunity for the business to detect or prevent fraud and reduce losses and associated costs. Rarely is the act of fraud a one-off. With financial statements of fraud, for instance, fraudsters often make multiple transactions to cover their tracks. In 2007, 91% of fraudsters were repeatedly fraudulent, compared with 96% in the 2011 analysis. So frauds are taking longer to be discovered, and they're also going on for longer periods of time. Repeated and long-running fraudulent activity may result in several red flags over a period. Recognizing and being alert to red flags and responding appropriately could save significant loss of value to the organization. It's notable that the average loss per fraud is substantial in some high-growth and emerging economies. And this graphic actually breaks down geographically, as I said, the average total losses per fraud for these various regions. So you can see that Asia and the Middle East are tied with an average of $1.5 million per fraud, with North America close behind that at $1.2 million, then Eastern Europe, followed by Western Europe, Africa, South America, and India comes in at the lowest fraud rates. Value per fraud at 0.7 or $700,000. In the context of individual transactions that make up the total fraud loss, the average transaction size was simply half that of Asia and the Americas. The lowest average transaction values were in India and Eastern Europe. While it can be difficult and costly to recover losses, there's been a significant increase in attempts to mitigate losses between 2007 and 2011. Up from 50% to 66%. This is possibly due to increased commercial pressures to recover the funds. There is, as there might be anticipated, a direct correlation between the size of the crime and attempts to recover the loss. Companies attempted to recover losses in excess of $25,000, recovered nearly 60% of the time, rising to more than 2/3 of the time when the loss exceeded $50,000. So the more money is at stake, the more likely they are to try to get it back. Collusion is also something that we noticed was on the rise. Right now, collusion is at 59% or so versus 41% in Europe and the Middle East and Asia. The Americas is at 66%. So our marketplace, our direct marketplace, is the most collusive, with the Asia Pacific coming into the middle. There's been a dramatic increase in the likelihood of collusion, and it often involves the circumvention of control systems by two or more parties, because the systems are increasingly sophisticated and it requires more than one person to commit the fraud. One of the interesting things that we noticed was that our study found that male perpetrators, 64%, are almost twice more likely to collude than women, 33%. After taking account of male dominance in the perpetrator group, Collusive females account for just 4% of the activities. Perpetrator groups are most typically all male or mixed gender. They rarely tend to be all women. Almost never, actually. Also, the amount of time that it takes to detect a fraud has gone up from 2.9 years in 2007 to 3.4 in 2011. In Asia, interestingly, the duration of fraud prior to detection is the longest, on average 5 years, with 16% of frauds going undetected for 10 years or more. This is possibly because employees in Asia tend not to challenge their successors or to rock the boat as much as in Western Europe or North America, where just 3% of fraud goes undetected for 10 years or more. And this is an interesting cultural point. That, in the Asian marketplace, that's very true. That an unwillingness to expose the weaknesses of one's superiors can make investigations very difficult. So you have the marketplace, let's say in China, where there's a culture of not confronting your superiors at the same point, or that has the largest value per fraud in the world, about $1.5 million. So the stakes are high. Fraud is generally has taken longer to detect in the emerging economies. North America averages 4.2 years, Australia 4.3, Western Europe 3.7, compared with high-growth economies. South America, for instance, averages 2.1 years. So in emerging markets, the frauds are exposed quicker. For organizations where fraud endures over a number of years, organizations need to be asked about the effectiveness of controls, detecting and preventing fraudulent activity, and about the effectiveness of management oversight in responses to red flags. So, what do we do about this? A big part of it has to do with raising the awareness with companies at the time that the fraud investigation begins. The 2011 survey data reveals a slight decrease in internal disclosure of fraud, down from half of all cases in 2007 to 46%. I think I have a slide here. Full disclosure, the details fell from 35% in 2007 to 13% in 2011. In India, 88% of frauds were not communicated, and in Eastern Europe, 72% of frauds. Both places have the least propensity to reveal details of fraud, while the most transparent countries are South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. In 2011, they disclosed details in all but 36% of cases. With regard to, the figures also suggest that companies may not take the opportunity to leverage learning points or instill a culture of zero tolerance to fraud within the workplace. In many circumstances, follow-up procedures should include internal and, where appropriate, external communications to set the corporate tone on fraud and to deter its recurrence. Companies tend not to make details of fraud publicly available unless required by law, and or when the loss is material to previously unreported financial results. In the 2011 analysis, 77% of investigations did not reach the public domain.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Previously unreported or previously reported?
Previously, the loss is material to previously reported financial results.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. However, reporting can be used to send a clear message to potential perpetrators that fraud will not be tolerated and increases the likelihood of recovery in the event of successful prosecution. Of course, where the financial loss is less significant than the potential damage to the corporate reputations, companies may choose not to report their suspicions to the police and will conduct their own internal investigations. The outcomes of these that we noted were as follows. First of all, disciplinary action, taken in 44% of cases, 54% in the Americas compared with 23% in the Asia Pacific, followed then by enforcement actions, which were regulatory, legal, or police actions, 45% of cases, the lowest of which were in Africa, which were at 40%. Civil recovery, which was 23% of cases, resignation or voluntary retirement, which was 17% of cases, settled out of court was 6%, and took no action was 3%. So it looks, disciplinary actions are the most popular action. Broken out by geography, In North America, enforcement was taken in 63% of cases and discipline in 68%. In South America, the enforcement or disciplinary actions was almost half of that of North America, so 36% for each. In Asia, enforcement action was taken at 40% of cases. The region has the highest incidence of resignation and voluntary retirement at 28%, which is higher than anywhere else in the world. Africa's enforcement actions, including police and legal actions, was taken in 65% of cases, with disciplinary action also high at 51%. Disciplinary action is the most common recourse in Eastern Europe and was taken 33% of the time. Voluntary retirement was taken just 24% of the time, and law enforcement was involved 17% of the time. Enforcement action was taken in 1/4 of cases in India, and similarly, voluntary disciplinary action occurred in 25% of cases, and resignation voluntarily or voluntary retirement in 19%. In the Middle East, enforcement action is taken in 57% of cases, civil recovery in 43%, and disciplinary action in 29%. In this region, resignation or voluntary retirement was not taken in any of the cases investigated. So what does this all add up to? It seems, based on our study, that fraud is up and the defenses are down. The general characteristics of the fraudster appear to be changing only moderately. We see the middle-aged member of middle to senior management still being the subject of many of our fraud investigations. There's a slight trend toward the individual being more tenured at the company. More interesting is how the failure to initially respond to red flags and lapses in internal controls has increasingly been a contributor to enabling the fraud to occur. Also, the impact of the economic crisis seems to have resulted in an increasing number of companies seeking to recover their fraud losses in the hopes of minimizing the financial consequences to the organization. With increased economic pressure on individuals, failure to identify or address red flags, and the lengthening timelines between fraud inception and detection, increases the likelihood that frauds currently undetected will emerge in greater numbers in the next 2 to 3 years. For companies, the challenge is to see how, through the ordinary disguises of the fraudster, and how to close their gaps in corporate armor, how to enhance fraud prevention and detection efforts, and how to respond more often and more appropriately to red flags. And we identified what some of those behavioral flags are. And we have I have separate charts here, one of which is actual red flags themselves, and the other one is behaviors that we associate with fraud. And so things like excessive secrecy about a function, or someone who passes over promotions repeatedly because they want to stay where they are signs of someone who that there may be a problem. Additionally, the behaviors that we associate with fraudsters include things like rarely taking a holiday, refusing to produce information on requests, bullying or intimidating colleagues, and a volatile or arrogant person who's aggressive when challenged. So anyway, this matrix is something that we developed to help us with our investigations. But as I said, we anticipate that the number of fraud cases that will be detected will increase in the next 2 to 3 years. And that's a real driver for, as we all know, in the forensics arena and in the consulting arena and across our industry. So we anticipate that it will continue. As part of what KPMG does, obviously we audit, we do tax, and we also do fraud analysis. So this is something that we do in concert with our other partners in the space. And with that, I know we have a time crunch, so I'm going to try to keep brief. That's my email. Do we have any questions? No? Yes.
Hold on. We have a real fellow sign.
Quick question, is there a difference between a public company and a private company that you see? I mean, ostensibly, the audits were to, you know, address some of the fraud.
We see, we see it across both public and private companies. I think with public companies, you tend to see the fraud being exposed more by maybe a shareholder inquiry or by an SEC or PCAOB inquiry, whereas a private sector company, the fraud may be exposed more by a dispute to something else, conflict related, as opposed to regulatory.
Anybody else? Question over here?
Yeah.
I apologize if you hit on this before. Just, did you have an industry breakdown or type of fraud, intellectual property versus EFT?
We didn't actually. We didn't have it broken out by industry. We did it geographically and sort of by social demographic, but we didn't break it out across industry.
Okay. And how about types of fraud? If it was monetary, if it was
Yes,
intellectual property?
Yes, the types of fraud that we analyzed had to do with direct embezzlement cases or misstatements of assets or earnings, financial misstatements, and the third type had to do with, check my notes because I have it in methodology. Yes, abuse and abusive expenses.
Two questions. Are there emerging trends, and what are some of the best tips?
I would say that the emerging trends that we're seeing have to do with cross-border investment. So where you have companies, let's say, I've spent a lot of time working on China, Chinese reverse IPOs, and that's a great example of this, where a Chinese company that is cash rich but wants access to the American marketplace for investment buys a failing public company that's traded on the NASDAQ, thereby getting around the regulatory disclosures. And then all of a sudden they're a biodiesel company. And what we found, particularly in investigations in China, and this absolutely floored me, was after 20 years as a PI in New York, you get used to a certain level of gumshoe fraud that you don't normally see at the corporate level. But these frauds included everything from sophisticated financial transactional fraud to really basic things like getting all your investors to come on a certain day and producing a small vial of biodiesel and showing it to them and saying, see, this is the clear, perfect biodiesel that we are producing, and here are 20 trucks lining up at our tankers to fill, except that they're filling the tankers with water. And the composters that are full of garbage, which are supposed to be generating biodiesel, in fact, are still full of rotting garbage 6 months later. And when you really look at the capacity or their refining capacity or their overall stock of raw materials, however you look at it, there's a lot of different levels of deception. And I think you really have to be conscious of that we're not just looking for blips in data, but you're also looking for how is the research controlled, how did they control what we saw. I think it was a real lesson for me to learn that during Asian investigations particularly, the concept of truth-telling as we know it versus truth-telling in the Chinese sense are two very different things. And so that would be something else. I would say also keep your eye on places like Brazil, which have a lot of access to the American market now. There's a lot of interest there. Whereas Asia has more controls than they did maybe 5 years ago. South America is much more open these days. They're selling a lot of resources to places like China and other parts of the world, to India, who don't have the petrochemical resources or mineral resources they do. But misstatements about how much they're refining, how much they have on hand, all that sort of thing tend to be very easy to commit, particularly at the higher levels in these organizations.
Bill?
From equity funding to Enron, one of the red flags that was important was numbers that were too good to be true.
Correct.
You didn't mention that one. Is it going away?
I would say that numbers that are too good to be true are they're less obvious than they used to be. I would say that people are increasingly just trying to maintain a certain level of profitability. We're not seeing the sort of the crazy, we make 25% a year. I think most people see that as a Madoff-esque kind of red flag. But what you will see is companies that maybe don't have the best business plan or their best sales and are misreporting their earnings and are misreporting it consistently.
Anybody else?
Thank you very much.
Hey, listen, what else would we expect from KPMG, right? You know, on time, on the cost, hey? On the budget. On the budget, there you go.